Welcome to the fourth and final video. So in the previous video, I started to introduce the species belonging to the earliest purported hominins. So the oldest one, Sahelanthropus chinensis, dated 7 to 6 million years ago. The next oldest one was Tugenensis, dated to 6 million years ago. And again, these are purported hominins because there are supporters who think they're hominins, but there are detractors who think they're not hominins. And that's because they have this mix of primitive ape-like traits and more derived human-like traits, very much what you would expect for a very, very early hominin. So it's very difficult to tell whether they're actually hominins or whether they're really ancient, let's say, chimpanzees or bonobos. Now we're going to continue with the earliest purported hominins and talk about Ardipithecus cadaba and Ardipithecus ramidus. So again, we have our three doors, our three candidates for the earliest hominin. Now behind door number 3 is Ardipithecus, which is a genus with 2 species. So Ardipithecus cadaba and Ardipithecus ramidus are both found at this region called the Middle Awash, which is located in Ethiopia. So you can see that here. And again, this is Eastern Africa. So here's the Middle Awash. Pretty much a lot of the Eastern African paleontological sites look like this. It's just badlands, not a lot of vegetation growth, and just exposures of sediments with lots of fossils within. So Ardipithecus cadaba is thought to be the direct ancestor of Ardipithecus ramidus. So we're actually talking about the earliest hominin. In this case, we are actually just talking about cadaba. So here again, we have time, oldest at the bottom, youngest at the top. And so why do they think cadaba and ramidus are ancestors and descendants? Why do they form an ancestor-descendant relationship? It's because cadaba has this canine that is very triangular shape, very much like a chimpanzee. And you see with ramidus, it becomes more diamond shape, which is more hominin-like. And we really see that diamond shape with Australopithecus afarensis, a later hominin. So it forms this, these three species form this morphological sequence, which is thought to reflect this gradual change in shape, and thus that's why it is believed that cadaba is a direct ancestor to ramidus. Okay, so Ardipithecus cadaba. If we break down the names as before, Ardi means ground in the local Afar language. Again, Pithecus means ape, and cadaba means family ancestor. So just by naming the species as such, they're making a statement that this thing was bipedal, and that it was the direct ancestor to all later hominins and thus us. And Ardipithecus cadaba was analyzed, studied, and published by Ethiopian scientist named Johannes Haile Selassie. It is dated to about 5.8 to 5.5 million years ago by, surprise, surprise, potassium argon dating. Again, the most common dating method for sites in Eastern Africa. And it lived in a woodland environment. Okay, so Ardipithecus cadaba, here is a side view of the upper canine, lower canine, and that lower third premolar. And here is the same for a chimpanzee for comparison. So we can see with cadaba that the triangle shape is very similar to a chimpanzee, and the canines are quite large. However, there is apical wear, but there is also wear on the back side of the canine, which remember is indicative of canine premolar honing. And so you can even see here, because of the lighting, it shows it, the front side of the premolar is actually quite polished, indicative of wear by being contacted with the premolar, or the upper canine, sorry. So this canine actually shows a mix of both honing and apical wear. So a mix of primitive and derived. Again, what you might expect in the earliest hominin. Right, so this gets a thumbs up and a confused sad face. So the apical wear makes it quite hominin-like. The honing on the back makes it not really hominin-like, makes it more ape-like. And there is a toe bone preserved that is indicative of bipedalism, as argued by the discoverers of Ardipithecus cadaba, but I will not go into that. Okay, Ardipithecus ramidus, so the descendant of Ardipithecus cadaba. So Ardipithecus ramidus is dated to 4.4 million years ago, dated by potassium argon. We already went over Ardipithecus. So what does ramidus means? Ramidus means root in the local Afar language. So again, very much communicating to everyone else that this is the root species of all later hominins, thus the ancestor of all later hominins. Ardipithecus ramidus was discovered by paleoanthropologist Tim White and their other colleagues. So you see Johannes Haile Selassie is also part of that same team. Ramidus and cadaba were pretty much discovered at the same site. And here is Owen Lovejoy, the one who came up with that provisioning hypothesis for bipedalism. So Ardipithecus ramidus was a huge deal when it was published. And your textbook actually says, anthropologists worldwide call it the breakthrough of the century. It was published and in fact got the cover of the very prestigious scientific magazine Science. And usually you publish one article in Science and that is already a big deal. But to really illustrate and drive home how big of a deal Ardipithecus ramidus was, they did not get only one article, they got the entire issue. So they got every single article, and each one of these is about a different facet of Ardipithecus ramidus. And there was also a documentary that came out on the Discovery Channel called Discovering Ardi. So very big deal. So why was Ardipithecus ramidus such a big deal? Well, there were 284 specimens of the species discovered, and at least 35 individuals from this one site. So that's really remarkable. And we have a partial skeleton here, and this is the artist's reconstruction. This is the specimen ID number, but the nickname is Ardi. So given how complete the skeleton is and the number of Ardipithecus fossils found at that site, it is already remarkable on its own. But that combined with the fact that it was so old and near that time, that 7 to 5 million year old window, which we would expect the last common ancestor between chimpanzees and humans to exist, this becomes a very important find. So again, the age has potential to shed light on the earliest hominins. And because we have a complete skeleton, we can say things like Ardipithecus was 4 feet tall as an adult, so quite short. It weighed 110 pounds. It had arms and legs similar in length, so kind of intermediate between chimpanzee, which has longer arms, and a human, which has longer legs. And actually, similar arms and legs is indicative of moving around on all fours. And I'll go into that in more detail later on. And there's little sexual dimorphism between males and females. Again, we know that because there were so many individuals recovered, which were a combination of males and females. Ardi is a female. So why is Ardipithecus ramidus a hominin? What are the derived human-like traits that it exhibits? Here we're looking at the underside of the cranium. And so it has an anteriorly placed foramen magnum. So that foramen magnum is moved towards the front, indicative of the skull balancing on top of the vertebral column. There's apical wear on the canines, so no wear on the back, no canine premolar honing. Even though the canines are still pretty large, but there's apical wear, which again is one of the defining traits for defining a hominin. The hip blades are wrapped towards the front. So here's a side view of the hip bone. We can see human, here's ramidus, and here's a chimpanzee. So you can see the blade orientation much more similar between ramidus and Homo sapiens, humans, as compared to a chimpanzee. So the hip blade is wrapped towards the front. Again, remember, very important for those hip stabilizer muscles. The foot has transverse and longitudinal arches. So again, remember, that's important for acting as shock absorbers, but also conserving energy as you step down. The arches kind of splay out, store that energy, and so when you lift and toe off with your foot, it already has some energy, so you have to use your muscles less. So what makes Ardipithecus ramidus primitive? As you can probably tell from that previous photo, the foot has a divergent toe, very chimp-like, right? And also has long, curved toes. Again, very indicative of chimpanzee, where the toe is stuck to the outside, and the other toes are long and curved. So all this is great for grasping branches, great for life in the trees. Ardipithecus ramidus also had a very small brain, 300 to 350 cubic centimeters, very much in the range of chimpanzees. And as I alluded to earlier, the canines are still quite large. So you can see here, right, and I believe this one is from Ardi, so this is actually female, which are expected to have smaller canines, although in Ardipithecus ramidus, there's not much sexual dimorphism. But you can see here, compared to chimpanzee, very, very large, not as large in Ardipithecus, smaller, but still larger than the canine of a human. And Ardipithecus does have a small diastema to accommodate those larger canines. So, given its very weird morphology, how did Ardipithecus ramidus move around? Right? It has these arms and legs of equal length. It has these wrapped hip blades, but it has this foot that has this divergent big toe, long curved toes, even though it still has these transverse and longitudinal arches. Well, the combination of those primitive arboreal traits and derived human traits led the researchers who studied Ardipithecus to say that Ardipithecus ramidus was adapted to life on the ground, that is bipedal walking, and life in the trees. So it was a facultative biped, not an obligate biped. It moved on its palms and feet in the trees. So here's a picture of that. So that's why it had legs and arms that are approximately equal in length, which again is indicative of moving around on all fours. So it was thought that Ardipithecus did that in the trees. So Ardipithecus in this case was kind of a jack of all trades. It could walk on the ground, not as efficiently as us, but it still had arboreal adaptations. So great for an environment that is mixed trees and grasses. So Ardipithecus ramidus did not suspend in the trees and knuckle walk on the ground like chimpanzees. Why is this a big deal? It's because before Ardipithecus, paleoanthropologists used to use chimpanzees as a stand-in for the last common ancestor between chimpanzees and bonobos on the one hand and humans on the other. Right? It was thought that the last common ancestor looked exactly like a chimpanzee. Well, Ardipithecus shows if it indeed is an early hominin, and it did not look like a chimpanzee, it did not move around like a chimpanzee, then the last common ancestor likely did not look like a chimpanzee. So here's a way to show that. This is that same picture again, time, oldest at the bottom, youngest at the top. We have chimpanzees and bonobos, their lineage, we have the human lineage, and we have the last common ancestor between these two lineages. Everything on this side is a hominin. Okay, so here we have the last common ancestor. So it's previously thought that the last common ancestor, when chimpanzees and bonobos branched off, they evolved very little, if at all, and basically looked exactly the same, hence the blue circles. Whereas hominins, on the other hand, diverged and evolved on their own trajectory and became very specialized as, say, for example, bipedal walkers, and thus look very different from the last common ancestor. So red, different from blue. So this is a traditional hypothesis. The Ardipithecus team, on the other hand, says that actually the last common ancestor looked neither like a chimpanzee nor like a human, and that chimps and bonobos actually had their own evolutionary history and changed relative to the last common ancestor. Right? It's kind of egotistical and anthropocentric to think that we would have evolved so much, but chimpanzees and bonobos did not. And of course, on the hominin side, we evolved, diverged, became specialized bipedal locomotors, and did our own thing. So you can see we have blue chimpanzees, red humans. Last common ancestor looked like neither. And so what the Ardipithecus team is saying is that you cannot use modern taxa to infer what the last common ancestor looked like. You need to go to the fossil record, look for these fossils to actually know what these earlier hominins and the last common ancestor look like. But again, as with all the earliest hominins, there's controversy, there are detractors. So this was a paper published and asked, well, what if Ardipithecus branched off the last common ancestor early on and did its own thing, right? So here we have chimpanzees, we have hominins here, this is the last common ancestor. So what if Ardipithecus branched off quite early? On the human side, I should note, so this author is actually accepting that these are hominins, and you can see Sahelanthropus and Auroran is included. But if they branched off early and evolved their own morphology, then Ardipithecus actually says nothing about what the last common ancestor looked like, which still could have been chimp-like. So chimp-like, but then evolved, and it evolved its own special adaptation, right? Crawling around on all fours in the trees. So Ardipithecus ramidus environment, what did it look like? Given its arboreal adaptations, you would expect there would be a lot of trees. And you're right, but first, not only is the Ardipithecus ramidus discovery noteworthy because of how many of the species was discovered there, but there were also over 150,000 plant and animal fossils discovered at that site. So many hundreds of thousands of non-Ardipithecus fossils, which is amazing. You usually don't find fossil sites this productive, right? So here are the ankle bones. You can see of mammals, just different kinds, and just a range of size categories, right? So you have things like very small rodents all the way to big elephants. And the makeup of those animals, we see that most of them are cercopithecids, specifically columbines, and trigelaphines. So this is an antelope that is indicative of a wooded environment. And of course, we know columbines are indicative of a wooded environment. There are also many bird bones preserved, which in and of itself is amazing because bird bones are very delicate. They're paper thin, right, which is an adaptation for them being able to fly and not carry a lot of weight. So it's very remarkable that these were not destroyed and were actually preserved. And the makeup of birds shows that they occupied mostly woodland habitat. So it agrees with the analysis based on the mammals. We also have hackberry seeds preserved, so indicative of trees. And this is just fun. There are also dung beetle brood balls preserved. So dung beetles, they roll poop, right, for eating. And I believe they do use it. I think they hatch their larvae in there. And so this was actually preserved at the site too. So amazing preservation, all kinds of fossils, many fossils, which all contribute to this woodland reconstruction of this site. So Ardipithecus ramidus lived in a wooded environment, again, very much a falsification of the savanna hypothesis. And so an artist's reconstruction, according to the artist, it would have looked something like this. And there is Ardipithecus crawling around on all fours on a tree branch, along with its mate, presumed to be monogamous because the species is not very sexually dimorphic. Okay, so that concludes our fourth video. So we first went over the major morphological trends in hominin evolution, and that was to place into context what was a primitive ape-like trait and what was a derived human-like trait. We then talked about where most hominins are found, and that is mostly East Africa and South Africa. One of the exceptions to that rule is Sahelanthropus chadensis, found in Central Africa in the country of Chad. And then we talked about Auroran tugenensis, Ardipithecus cadaba, Ardipithecus ramidus. So this goes from oldest, next oldest, younger, and youngest. But all are in that time range of 7 to 5 million years ago when you would expect the last common ancestor to exist. And thus, these are candidates for the earliest hominins, but it is controversial because they show this blend of primitive ape-like traits and derived human-like traits, which again is exactly what you would expect from a hominin that just diverged from the last, just evolved and speciated from the last common ancestor. So establishing the earliest hominin and whether it actually is a hominin is a very, very difficult task. And so these are the candidates, but it's still controversial whether they're A, actually hominins, and B, whether they actually are the hominin ancestor that gave rise to all other hominins.